Well, hello everyone. We are live, and hey, it's so wonderful to see all of you logging in. I'm Gustavo Tolosa from Dallas, Texas. I have here to my right or left, whatever it is in your screen, the famous and only Chef AJ from Los Angeles, California. And excited to see you all and excited to hear what AJ has to say. So, how are you doing today, AJ?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you so much for doing this. You truly are the webinar wizard. We wouldn't have any of these webinars without you.
Well, it's always fun to do it, and I've had a break for a few weeks, and I'm glad to be back and doing this. And I will be in California actually tomorrow. So
Wonderful.
anyway, so today, everyone, we have a free webinar with Chef AJ being so generous to do this. And the point of this webinar is not that she's going to tell you right now how to cook everything in the universe, okay?
Right.
That would be a 100-hour.
That'd be a long webinar.
The point is that she will give you general ideas of how to cook without salt, sugar, flour, and what else was that?
Oil.
Yeah, oil.
Sugar, oil, flour, alcohol, salt. And then we have some people with other intolerances like gluten and beans and nightshades and things like that, nuts. So I'm going to give them concepts that I think might help them in their journey to eating healthier, even if they have certain dietary restrictions.
Very good. All right. So remember that this webinar is recorded and then it's going to be sent to you all with a different link for everybody to see. If there are any problems with the picture or anything, it's due to maybe some of the internet speeds. But this webinar is recorded well, so when you get the replay, it will be nicely recorded. So without further ado, I will just let AJ go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks all of you for being here and those watching on the replay. Thank you for taking the time to watch this. So the title of this webinar is How to Cook Everything When It Feels Like You Can't Eat Anything. And I want to discuss some basic concepts. But first, I want to extend an apology if there was confusion as to what this webinar was about. Because when Gustavo sent an email to everyone telling them to email me with the questions, many of the questions were not about cooking at all. And I'm going to answer them. I'm not going to answer them on this webinar because this is specifically about cooking. So a lot of your questions were medical questions, which I can't answer anyway because I'm not a medical doctor. Perhaps when Gustavo starts the Google webinars again, they can be answered then. Or in the meantime, I encourage you to go to the website vegdocs.com, VEGDOCS.com, and see if you can find a plant-based doctor in your area. If you can't, then all of the wonderful True North doctors, their medical doctors and naturopaths, do consults either via phone or Skype for less than $100, and you can get your questions regarding your personal health issues that may or may not be related to the plant-based diet answered that way. So I apologize, but I can't even attempt to answer any medical questions. Now, another set of questions that came in, I am going to answer, but not on this webinar because they're more under the umbrella of what I would call my Weight Loss Wednesday weekly show that I do every Wednesday at 4 p.m. Pacific time, live on my Facebook page, and then it goes to YouTube within 24 hours. So a lot of the questions were about food addiction, sugar addiction, how to get families on board, how to talk to people, and I am passionate about that subject, and I'm more than happy to answer those questions. And so when you email me, I save them, and I'm going to answer them Wednesday. But today, I'm going to answer the questions you've emailed me that pertain to this topic, as well as after I talk a little bit about it, then we're going to open up the chat and then you can ask me questions live. Does that sound good, Gustavo? Yep. Okay, I see him. So
That's great.
this happens every time I am online. She wants to be on my lap. We need to do a webinar on why dogs are so needy when you're talking to other people. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this topic is because when my book on process came out about 7 years ago, I put my email at the back of the book. And I said, if there's anything I can do to assist you in your journey to optimum health, please email me. And people do every day. And I'm very happy that they do. But some of the emails that I get have to do with what I would call recipe development, which is, it's not my area of expertise, but as somebody who is a food addict, albeit in recovery, it's not my area of interest anymore to keep continually creating recipes. There's some wonderful chefs that will do it. For example, Kathy Hester, she could probably solve every problem you guys have right now with finding a recipe that is either excluding ingredients you can't or including ingredients you want. And I've actually talked to her about writing a book specifically for the people in the Ultimate Weight Loss Program, because I don't want to be in the kitchen and having to keep inventing and testing recipes. But in doing that, I've created probably a couple of hundred recipes by now. And I want you to glean from my expertise what I've learned, especially if you're somebody that feels that they have restrictions or limitations and want food to be made delicious. And I want you to know that in case you're unfamiliar with who I am, there are about 63 episodes of a show that I did several years ago called The Chef and the Dietitian, already on YouTube. They are video tutorials, because some of the questions you've asked, which I'll answer, those answers are actually in the video if you watch the video. For example, how to saute mushrooms, how to caramelize onions. I've done 13 episodes of a television show called Healthy Living with Chef AJ. There's at least 40 recipes there. And again, a lot of the technique that we're going to discuss are in these episodes, as well as 14 webinars with Gustavo. 7 of them free and 7 of them with a slight fee. And the cooking ones definitely answer a lot of those questions. So what I want to talk about first is following a recipe, because it's hard to make substitutions if you don't know what you're substituting. I teach hands-on cooking at a culinary school very close to my home. And what I notice a lot is when people, they get excited because it's a hands-on class and they see the ingredients all prepped for them in the machines and they just start throwing things in and they've never read the recipe. So one of the things I'd like to advise you to do, unless you're cooking improvisationally, which is great, by the way, it's, when you think about it, cooking is actually an art, and you can be improvisational, maybe not so much with things like spices like red pepper and salt. You can't just decide to throw in as much as you want, but cooking in general is an art form, and you can do more substituting. You can do more improvisation. Whereas I think of baking as more of a science. I was a pastry chef at a Los Angeles restaurant that was not even vegan for 5 years. I made desserts without sugar, oil, salt. Only one of them had flour. I just didn't tell them. This was my niche for about 5 years. But in following a baking recipe, you cannot be improvisational the way you can be with a cooking recipe. So I get a lot of questions like, well, what do I substitute for this sugar, this flour? And I'm going to go into that in a second. But first I want to talk about is if you're making a recipe, especially for the first time, that isn't your recipe, my first piece of advice is to actually read it through, and then read it through again, and then read it through again. And then make sure you have all your ingredients there when you're going to make the recipe. We call that mise en place. It's a French word for everything in its place, because the last thing you want to do is have that recipe planned for your dinner party or for other reasons and then find out you don't have the ingredients. So that's one of the reasons you read it through. Make sure you have all the ingredients on hand. And if you don't have them on hand and you still want to make that recipe, instead of panicking about what you're going to substitute because you don't have millet flour, see if you can get all the ingredients first and have them all in front of you and maybe even measured out. That really, really helps if you do that. So that's the first thing you want to do is read it. Now, I recommend that the first time you try a recipe from someone else, unless you're actually allergic to one of the ingredients in it, or maybe it's a migraine trigger, is to really follow the recipe as designed. Because at least for me, and I'm not sure about the other chefs, but we could ask them, when I create a recipe, I'm going for a specific thing. And it takes me a long time to create one recipe. That's why I'm not prolific like some of these people like Kathy Hester and Robin Robertson that are creating thousands and thousands of recipes. In the last, 10 years, I've created maybe over 200. But I take my time and I practice them over and over, and I go for what I'm trying to achieve in that recipe, especially because it is more limited in the way I cook to other people that especially have not neuroadapted to the taste of whole natural food, because I am not using sugar, I'm not using oil, I'm not using salt, I'm also not using flour and alcohol, I have to be very careful to make sure that the recipe doesn't just taste good to me because I'm happy eating just plain sweet potato and broccoli, but that it will taste good to what I call the others, the regular people. And all the recipes that I produce that I'm sharing with the world, either through cookbooks or webinars, are recipes that I've tested on other people. I eat much more simply than my recipes. And so when you realize that, especially when you've taken out the salt, oil, and sugar, it's really important, in my opinion, to follow the recipe at least the first time, unless you're allergic, as it's written. And let me give you an example of what happens when you don't. So I got an email from a gentleman who said that he made my red lentil chili and it was terrible. And that email really surprised me, because of all my recipes, I probably get more thank you emails for that recipe than any other, because it's a really good recipe. It ran on Forks Over Knives. It was suggested as a Super Bowl recipe, and a lot of people really, really love that recipe. And if you make it the way that I wrote the recipe, you shouldn't have any trouble. And it was the first time I got an email saying this was like the worst thing I ever ate. And so I said to him, I said, well, did you follow the recipe? And then he wrote back, he said, well, I made a few substitutions. And I said, could you tell me what those substitutions were? And he said, well, I didn't have red lentils, so I used brown lentils. I didn't have red bell pepper, so I used green bell pepper. I didn't have any dates, so I used prunes. I didn't have any smoked paprika, so I used sweet paprika. And I didn't have any chipotle powder, so I didn't put it in. Now, could you see how substituting those things or not having those things could make an entirely different recipe? Now, sometimes that might make a magical, delicious recipe that could be an even better recipe. But you can't just substitute one ingredient for the other and have it be the recipe that the chef intended. So brown lentils and red lentils, they taste different, they look different, they cook different, number one. Green bell peppers are not ripe, and they taste much different than red bell peppers, much different right there. Well, smoked paprika is much, much different than sweet Hungarian paprika. And if you've ever eaten a prune, as delicious as they are, you know they don't taste like dates. And so it wasn't just a matter of substituting one thing. It was substituting many things. And then, of course, the recipe didn't work. So I really want you to think about, when you follow people's recipes, it's great to be improvisational. I encourage people to color outside the lines and make my recipes and everybody's recipe their own. But I really recommend that the first time you make it, unless there is a true allergy, that you make it as designed so that you know what it's supposed to taste like. That's why there's such a benefit, in my opinion, of actually taking in-person cooking classes, if you can find them, or going to culinary school, as opposed to just doing an online program, because then you really know what it's supposed to look like, what it's supposed to taste like, and you get that hands-on experience. So does that make sense, Gustavo, about all the substituting, that it can lead to a disaster in many cases?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. Although I'm one of those that follow the recipes to the T. I'm not, but I also like to make up recipes.
But you also like to make up your own. But I don't want to say it's disrespectful to the chef, but you can't blame the chef for a recipe that you didn't follow, is what I'm trying to say. And it's interesting, because before I became a chef that created recipes, I've been a culinary instructor for 18 years now. I don't want to mention the name of a few of these restaurants, but there are restaurants in the world, and you may be familiar with some of them, where it actually says on the menu, no substitutions. Are you familiar that there's some recipes like that? And I think if restaurants do that, they should then offer just some simple things like a baked potato or a salad. But at first I would take offense, especially somebody that has allergies and an allergy to black pepper. And I would call ahead and they say, I'm sorry, the chef doesn't make substitutions. And there's even some famous vegan restaurants like that. And at first I would get really upset and like, what nerve? But when I talked to them about it, the reason is because the chef's vision for that dish and the execution would not be fulfilled if they started taking one from column A and one from column B, which is why restaurant eating can be very difficult for people that have a more restrictive diet or food allergies. But I get what they were saying. I didn't get it at first, but now that I'm somebody that creates recipes and have people, bastardize some of my recipes and then say they didn't taste good, I understand that. And so that's one of the things I really want to say, is that especially in SOS-free cooking, sugar-free, oil-free, salt-free cooking, it's much more difficult. And to give you an example, I did a webinar with Gustavo just a few months ago, and I think we called it an easy dinner party or something like that. And I made a recipe from Chef Anya Cass. It was a smoked paprika cheese, and it's a really delicious recipe. In her original recipe, it called for a teaspoon of salt. Well, that's a lot of salt, especially if you don't use salt. Especially in my book. I made the recipe without the salt, and her recipe is fabulous, by the way. But you can't just expect to take something out and not put something else in its place that's going to make it taste good. So when I made her recipe and took out the salt, it didn't taste good. Because what is cheese after all, whether it's plant-based cheese or regular cheese? It's fat and salt. Sugar, fat, and salt is what we like. That's basically what most recipes are. And it's interesting because when I first met Dr. Goldhammer 7 years ago, he said that we think of somebody as a great chef because of their ability to concentrate sugar, fat, and salt, because we're genetically hardwired to prefer the taste of these three things. And what restaurant food is that we love and what fast food and what processed food is sugar, fat, and salt. And so if you're following a diet without sugar, without salt, and that's lower in fat, you can't expect to just take one or all three of these components out and have it taste good. And that's what I'm trying to explain to people, because when they post on our Ultimate Weight Loss group page a recipe that they've never tried, and they'll say, looks good, minus the oil and salt, how do you know? Because in my opinion, unless the oil was there just for like a couple of tablespoons to saute, you can't just start removing things and expect it to taste as the vision of the chef, and maybe it won't even taste good. So in the example of the smoked paprika cheese, when I took the salt out, it tasted terrible. So I had to think about what could I put back in that would give it flavor without salt. So one of the things I use are spices, and I have a bunch of them here that I'll show you, but there's so many different salt-free spices. The question is, which one are you going to use? So my favorite one happens to be one called Benson's Table Tasty, because to me, it tastes the most like salt. It's also black pepper free, but it really does taste salty to me. So I put that back in, but realized that salt-free seasonings to salt, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. It might be, but this is why you can't just assume that you take something out and put something back in and it's going to work. You basically, when you modify a recipe, which in my opinion is much harder to do than creating one from scratch, you have to play with it. So I don't know that 1 teaspoon of Benson's Table Tasty is going to be the equivalent of 1 teaspoon of salt in that particular recipe. But when I put it in, it still seemed to be lacking. And so I used other things like smoked paprika and chipotle powder to bump it up. So I changed her vision because her original cheese maybe wasn't a little bit spicy, but that's sometimes what you have to do if you're using ingredients that aren't sugar, fat, salt, flour, and alcohol. It is much harder. And it's one of the reasons it's harder is, first of all, there's not a lot of people doing this kind of work. There's only 2 other chefs other than myself that have published books that are SOS free. Chef Ramses Bravo, his book Bravo, he's the executive chef at True North Health, and Kathy Fisher has a book called Straight Up Food, and she actually eats this way. And both of their recipes are delicious, but it takes a little bit more ingenuity and playing around with these ingredients to make food that is missing these ingredients taste good. The other thing is if you're used to eating a diet that's high in sugar, high in fat, high in salt, it's going to be much harder for this food to taste delicious anyway, no matter how good I do it. And that's why it's so important to me that my recipes that are missing these things taste good to regular people. I call it the Maria test. When I create a recipe, I test it on the cleaning crew of my apartment building, because these are people that eat the standard American diet. And if they like it, then I know that people that have a cleaner palate that eat this way will probably love it. I'll take a moment here to talk about why healthy food doesn't taste good to some people. And you've probably heard me talk about this on other presentations or on Weight Loss Wednesday, but I think it's worthwhile. You know, there's a process that occurs when we're trying to eat healthier called neuroadaptation, short for neurological adaptation. And most people in America eat 92% of their calories from animal products and processed food, and less than 10% from fruits and vegetables. And so we're eating a diet that's high in sugar, high in fat, high in salt, and in some cases, if they're not vegan, high in animal products. And so when we try to eat healthier, the healthy food doesn't taste good at first because we've habituated to a diet that is so stimulating with these highly processed foods, like sugar, like flour, like alcohol, like salt, that not only are highly caloric, highly concentrated foods that fool the brain satiety mechanisms, but they make us eat more food of the same kind. They either trigger us to eat more of the same kind of food, they perpetuate cravings. And so if this is what you're used to eating, and I offer you my oven roasted ratatouille over zoodles with quick sun-dried marinara, which is no salt, no sugar, no oil, very low in fat, you're probably not going to like it that much. And so the idea is you need to take the time to eat healthfully for a longer period of time so that healthy food actually tastes good. Now, if you were to go to the True North Health Center in Santa Rosa and do a medically supervised therapeutic water only fast, this process of neuroadaptation would go quicker. And I've seen it. Gustavo has seen it. We see people fast for as short as 5 days. And when they refeed on steamed zucchini, they practically have an orgasm because it tastes so good. They can actually taste the subtle saltiness in things like chard, maybe even not so subtle, and in celery. Eating an apple tastes like a hot fudge sundae. And so until one is willing to clean up their palate a little bit by eating more healthfully, the kind of changes that I'm proposing in the recipes may not taste as good to you until you do that. But I'm still going to tell you how to do it. And we're going to start with the first step, which I'm assuming that most people watching me are probably either vegan or considering vegan or on a plant-based diet. But the first thing is just transforming a standard American diet recipe to a vegan recipe. That can be done. That's not my area of passion. I used to do it for people. But we've proven now with all these wonderful chefs out there and all these wonderful vegan restaurants that there's pretty much nothing you can make now that is vegan that you can't make in the non-vegan world. And that's everything from all the hyper palatable foods for every kind of dessert. There's really nothing that someone can do in the standard American world that some ingenious vegan chef hasn't figured out how to do in the vegan world. It generally has a lot of sugar, fat, and salt, which is why we like it, because we like vegan junk food as much as we like regular junk food. But this can be done. This is not something I'm interested in because, believe it or not, I still get emails like, well, how do you make octopus? And I'm like, well, first of all, I've never tasted octopus even when I wasn't vegan, which was only for the first 17 years of my life. But as a chef, I can start thinking about how I might be able to create the textures and the flavors. And that's where I want you guys to start thinking, because if we can get you thinking this way for yourself, you're going to be able to create much more delicious recipes with the resources you have available. Now, I don't want people to eat octopus. So what I would say, and what I did say to this guy, is the first thing that came to me were hearts of palm. I mean, I've never tasted it, but when I've talked to people, they said it has kind of a chewy texture and it looks like these little white rings. And so I started thinking, well, what looks like a little white ring? Well, leeks, but no, leeks are in the onion type family. That wouldn't do it. So I thought, well, maybe hearts of palm. And that would probably make a texture that was similar. And then in general, when people eat octopus, it's usually fried. That's not something I'm going to do, but whatever batter that they would use could still be the same batter. So that's an example of how you take a non-vegan recipe, make it a vegan recipe by thinking of what went in that original recipe. A lot of times people will email me with their family's favorite recipe, whether it's, some kind of dessert their grandmother made or some kind of dish that was animal products. And they'll say, can you veganize this for me? I mean, I probably could. It takes a lot of time because, as I mentioned, for me, it takes longer to fix or make substitutions in an existing recipe than just trying to come up with something else. And all my recipes they were ones I came up with myself. I was maybe trying to recreate something that I had tasted in another world, like German chocolate cake or peanut butter chocolate cheesecake. But I didn't take somebody else's recipe and then try to first veganize it and then make it SOS free. I find, at least personally for me, it's easier to start from scratch. So let's talk about the components in the foods that people love so much, specifically the sugar, the oil, the salt, and then we'll get to the flour. I'm not going to really talk about alcohol so much because unless you're drinking alcohol, it's not found so much in recipes that you need to really have a substitution. Alcohol burns off when you cook it anyway. So every chef I've talked to that's created a recipe with half a cup of white wine or sauteing it in there, they've pretty much said you can actually just leave it out because it gets burned off. The substitutions for those, though, would be something like red wine vinegar or even balsamic vinegar if you want to get that little bit of tang. But that's probably the easiest thing to substitute or leave out. And it's not really prevalent in a whole bunch of recipes, at least the ones I've seen. So it's not something I'm going to worry about or spend a lot of time on. But sugar, fat, and salt are. Probably the easiest thing to substitute in a traditional recipe that's vegan to one that is going to be whole food plant-based without oil is the fat. Of sugar, fat, and salt, which is what I call the evil trinity in my book on processed. The oil is actually the easiest, believe it or not. And the reason is because oil really doesn't have any taste. Now, people say, oh, I'm Greek, I'm Italian, well, olive oil's in my blood, I love it. But think about it, guys. Have you ever tasted olive oil by itself? It's pretty nasty. And actually, at high doses, if you took a cup or so, it would be an emetic. It would make you vomit. Oil actually has no taste by itself. And I know people say, oh, but I dip bread in olive oil. Yeah, but you don't dip your thumb in olive oil. It's the bread that you're doing that for. I don't know anybody that just drinks olive oil or eats any kind of oil all by itself. It's a carrier for all the other flavors. And the interesting thing is of sugar, fat, and salt. Salt is the hardest thing for people to do without in all the recipes. But when you stop oil, you actually don't need as much salt because oil actually coats the taste buds of your tongue so that you can't taste the food. And then you need to greatly increase the salt. So when you stop the oil altogether, and we can talk a little bit, we have some questions on sauteing with oil and things like that. When you stop it, you have less of a need for as much salt. So oil is probably the easiest thing to take out of a recipe if the oil is being used as a mechanism to saute. So now if you have a recipe for a salad dressing and it calls for a half a cup of oil, you can't just take it out. You can't just substitute water. There's no substitute that I know of for oil if it's in a sauce like that. But most recipes, whether it's a soup or a stew or a chili or some kind of vegetable dish, lasagna, will tell you to saute the onion or the onion and the garlic. And it's usually 2 tablespoons. That's normal. Sometimes I've seen it up to 4 in oil. Well, that's really easy to take out of the recipe. Right there, we're talking like 600 calories and 60 grams of fat. So remember what Dr. McDougall says, the fat you eat is the fat you wear. So just stopping oil is going to improve your health, your cardiovascular health. And if you're somebody struggling to lose weight, it's one of the easiest ways to do it. I've told a story many times of how when we went SOS free, I didn't even tell my husband, Charles, that I stopped oil, and he lost something like 8 pounds in 7 months without even knowing that I had taken it out. So when you take the oil out in that mechanism, if you're sauteing, you can just substitute any other liquid. You can saute in water. You can saute in no sodium vegetable broth, depending on the recipe. Maybe if it's a teriyaki, you could substitute in orange juice or pineapple juice. So oil is really a triumph of marketing over science. It's not necessary for the recipe to work, but you can saute in anything. It doesn't have to be oil. And this is something that people are new to, this concept of no oil cooking. They're like, well, how am I going to saute? How am I going to roast? In something else or even in nothing? Because the truth is, if you have a proper piece of cookware, if you have something like waterless cookware or a good piece of maybe nonstick like the Copper Chef or something like that, or the Scan Pan, you really don't need anything. You can do a technique called dry sauteing. You can sweat your onions. And I've showed you that on a few of the videos I've done. I don't, like Dr. McDougall, I don't have an eidetic memory where I can remember exactly what episode I've showed that, but I've known I've showed it many times. You can actually caramelize onions in a pan without any oil, actually without even any liquid if you have the right pan. And if you're worried that it's going to stick or burn, then you can use a liquid, but the liquid doesn't have to be oil. There's nothing magical about oil. It's just a liquid. You can use water. As I said, no sodium vegetable broth. People that use alcohol sometimes use alcohol. You could use balsamic vinegar. So you just need a liquid. It doesn't have to be oil. When it comes to roasting, people have the same worry. They say, well, how am I going to roast vegetables without oil? Well, many of us now have gotten into air frying. We have either a small air fryer or we have the Breville. Well, the whole beauty of having an air fryer, it says you use little to no oil. I've never used oil in it, and it makes the most delicious, crisp, not only French fries, but every kind of vegetable you can imagine with no oil. So that's another way to cook without oil. Now, if you're roasting vegetables, which many people say that, well, they traditionally do it with oil and salt, you can take both these things out. You can roast vegetables with absolutely nothing, not even water. I've done it many times. What you want to do, though, is you make sure you have some kind of a nonstick surface, which is either something called a silicone baking mat. The first one, I believe, was invented in France. It's called a silpat. I have the same one that I've had since I was 27 years old. They do darken, but you can use them over and over. Or you can use parchment paper, which is not my preferred way to roast because I believe it's wasteful to the environment. You have to take a new piece out every time. But in order to roast, you just need what you're roasting, the vegetable. Now, of course, we talk about different densities of vegetables. If you're roasting very thick Brussels sprouts and potatoes, and you have something that's very that has like a more higher water content or a different density, like let's say a bell pepper, well, you wouldn't want to roast them together. You want to roast them on a different tray, or one could burn or one couldn't cook. But you really don't need oil at all to roast. You don't need it to saute. And believe it or not, you don't need it to bake. As I mentioned, I was a pastry chef for 5 years without oil, and there's so many substitutions for oil. I can tell you what the substitutions are, but what I can't tell you is what the substitution is in your particular recipe without actually making the recipe the first time and then trying to tweak it. You know, I'm sure all of you are familiar with Google, and a lot of the questions you've asked me, the answers are actually in Google. So for example, one of the questions I got was how to caramelize onions without oil. Well, I'm going to tell you, and I believe I did tell you, but when I Googled it this morning, probably 100 videos showing me how to do that came up, how to caramelize onions without oil, as well as it was something like 27,000 articles how to do it. So this information is actually out there. The way that I baked without oil was what is oil in a baked recipe? You can't really taste it in a chocolate cake. So you have to think about, why is it in there? See, because before you can substitute, you have to know what the purpose of it was in the recipe. Because the purpose of oil in a dish where you're asked to saute the onion, well, that was just to saute the onion. And people argue, well, it more flavor. But you know what? When I had time in my cooking classes that I teach in my home once a month, I used to make my nutrient-rich black bean soup twice. I used to make one time where I sauteed the onion in the 4 tablespoons of oil, and one time without it. And either no one could tell the difference, or they said this one was better, and it was the one without oil. You see, when you cook with sugar, oil, and salt, it dissipates. And that's why if people are insistent upon using salt and sugar, I tell them to at least do it the way Dr. McDougall recommends, where they use it as the finish towards the end of the recipe, where they sprinkle it on the surface of the food where the taste buds of the tongue can really taste it. Because when you cook with oil, when you cook with sugar, when you cook with salt, it dissipates anyway. As I said, if you have a recipe for a salad dressing that calls for a half a cup of oil, you can't just take that out and put water in like you could saute. So in baking, what I did, my personal favorite substitute was applesauce. I found that it was not terribly sweet, that it would affect the sweetness of it, but it created the most moist baked goods. Now, as a pastry chef, the only thing that I couldn't create, oil-free, sugar-free, salt-free, was that crispiness that people get, like, for instance, if they were going to bake chocolate chip cookies. Without oil, I could not do that. I still could make delicious cookies and delicious chocolate chip cookies, but they were more cake-like or doughy. I couldn't get that crispiness, and that's one thing that oil does, and that I have not personally been able to replicate without oil. Now, knowing what I know now, I probably could do it if I were to use nut butters, because fat is a great substitute for oil. If you're not following a low-fat plant-based diet, and not everybody has to, there are people that can eat nuts and seeds and avocado and tofu and either not be overweight, or it's still much healthier for you than oil. In my book Unprocessed, I have many recipes where I'm using these things to make delicious salad dressings, because you still get the mouthfeel from the creaminess from the fat. It's still calorically dense, albeit only about 3,000 calories per pound as opposed to 4,000 in oil, but it's still much more health promoting, because things like tahini, which is the paste of sesame seeds, or almond butter, which is, processed raw almonds. These are still much healthier foods. These are whole foods that are found in nature. And yes, they're calorically dense, but I don't have a problem with people using them unless, of course, they're telling me they're trying to lose weight or have heart disease. But whole food plant fats are a great substitute for oil. So if I was looking at a salad dressing recipe that had a half a cup of oil, well, what I would probably do, depending on the flavor profile of the recipe, is substitute a whole fat plant food, maybe tofu, maybe avocado. And I wish I could say to you guys, and maybe someone will write this book in the future. Kathy Hester would be my choice, because she is really a culinary genius. There's no recipe I've ever challenged her with that she couldn't create. Is that where we could say, okay, it's an equal swap, this for this. I'm not sure it's equal. But again, it always helps if you taste the original recipe that you're trying to substitute. And that's where I have difficulties in trying to adapt the recipes that you're sending me by email, because I don't want to make the original recipe, especially if it had animal products, especially if it had oil, sugar, and salt. So I don't know what it's going for. But what I've done really well doing, like I did this with my German chocolate cake when Hans Diehl asked me to create a German chocolate cake, is I can still create something really good, but it may not be what you remember that your grandma made from your childhood. So substituting whole food plant fats is a great substitute for oil, especially in salad dressings, in sauces, and they're absolutely delicious, and people still love them because, we're genetically hardwired to prefer the taste of sugar, fat, and salt, and there's still plenty of fat in those whole food plant fats. They're creamy, they're delicious, and they make great sauces, and that's really your first line of defense, especially if you're not doing the low-fat version of the vegan diet. And they're whole foods, and they're amazing, and they have some benefits, of course, the high-fat plant foods. So that would be my recommendation. I would tell everyone, whether they're overweight or not, even if they weren't vegan, is to ditch oil. It's one of the best things you can do for your health. But it's hard if you eat at restaurants. It's really, really hard because they pretty much use more oil, sugar, and salt in every recipe than you ever would at home. And even if you say no oil, that often, unfortunately, means less oil, and there's still often residual oil in the cookware. And the water that they're using to steam your vegetables or pasta probably had oil and salt put in. So, it just depends how strict you want to be. But that's how it works, at least in restaurants.
I have to agree with you 100%. It's impossible to eat pretty much oil-free in a restaurant.
I think it is, and a lot of times, they'll say no oil, and then first of all you see it glisten, and then you touch it, and you have enough to like have hair product, things like that. I mean, there may be some exceptions. I know that some people locally where they live have talked to chefs, and maybe it can be guaranteed. We have one place here that's a chain restaurant called Flame Broiler, where I know it doesn't have oil because their big thing of rice is just rice and there's no oil, and then they steam the vegetables. But other than that, I don't think I've ever had a meal anywhere at a restaurant where there wasn't at least some residual oil. So, but it is hard, but it tastes best when you make it yourself anyway, in my opinion, and that's one of the reasons that we're doing this. So that's what I say about oil. It can be substituted in baking. And again, I'm happy to answer your questions. I'm often very behind in email, but a lot of these questions, if you Google that, like how to substitute oil in baking, you'll probably get more information than I can even tell you, because new things are being discovered every day. Like, for example, since I became a chef, aquafaba, which is the use of the liquid from the beans that can now make whipped cream. Well, that's something I didn't learn in culinary school. That's something I didn't know. And that's right there. That is a great substitution when people say, well, how can I make meringues? How can I make whipped creams? So this is really, really cool. And it would be cool if there was like a comprehensive vegan substituting website out there. And maybe there is, or maybe somebody will start one, because it isn't an exact science, but I think that we can learn by doing, actually. And that's why it's really important, in my opinion, to know what your goal is and what you're making. And instead of just saying this recipe looks good minus the oil and salt, I would prefer people saying, well, what is it that I'm trying to create with this recipe, and how can I create it without oil and salt, rather than taking something out in the recipe and then trying to have to backtrack to figure out how to put it in, if that makes sense. At least that's the way I operate. I find it much harder. In culinary school, the motto was, it's not what you can make, it's what you can fix. But I find it's a lot harder to fix things than sometimes it is to create them from the bottom up. And that's why I encourage you guys, wherever you live, take a cooking class, preferably a plant-based one, because hands-on experience is the best thing of all. When I teach cooking, especially when I teach it at Mexico, I'll be at Rancho La Puerta next May, we go off book. So in other words, yes, we follow the recipes that I created for the class. And it's really interesting because when people follow my recipes, they're amazing. And I eat the meal that the class has created from my recipes. But there's often more students in the class than recipes. And so what I'll do to them is something my mom used to do to me when I was little, is she would give me some things. Like she'd give me like a shoe box, and she'd give me the green plastic thing from the strawberries. And if she was too busy to play with me, she'd go, make something. And I'm like, what am I going to make? But it allowed me to be creative. And so one of the things I do in my classes is I find ingredients. It's sort of like when we do the Iron Chefs, which is really wonderfully creative. And I have people in the class, and I'll just give them a few ingredients. I'll go make something. They go, what should I do? I go, I don't know. Pretend you just got home from dinner, and you got home, and all that was in your house was chard, cannellini beans, and a sweet potato. And it's amazing how probably most of my best recipes have come from working that way rather than working from a recipe. So let's talk about sugar. We're going to save salt for last because it's the hardest. Well, sugar mostly appears in things like sauces, salad dressings, and in baked goods and desserts. So, there are reasons that it'll appear in savory recipes, and that's often for flavor balancing. You've probably heard that in a half a cup of commercial tomato sauce, there's more sugar than in even 2 Oreos. And the reason that they put sugar in tomato sauce is because tomatoes are very acidic, and the sugar helps balance the acidity. Now, you could also argue that the processed food industry is doing that to hook us in, so we'll, be addicted to their product and eat more food. But even when I was little, I mean, we're talking 1960, my mom would make homemade marinara sauce, and there was always at least a teaspoon of sugar. And I'm like, well, why are you doing that? She said, to balance the acidity. If you're familiar with my recipe for red lentil chili, you'll know that there are 9 dates in the recipe. There's 3 ounces of dates, and they're blended up. And the reason is because I was going for sort of a sweet and sour feel, and it balanced the acidity of the tomato products in there. There was 2 cans of fire roasted salt-free tomatoes, and there was a 6-ounce can of tomato paste. Now, there are people in the Ultimate Weight Loss Program that for whom dates are a trigger if they buy them. Now, the thing is you can buy dates in bulk so that you could actually go to the store and buy the 9 for the recipe. But a lot of people, that's a problem. And so they were making the recipe without it, and they said it came out absolutely fine. When I made it without the dates, it wasn't horrible. It was fine, but it wasn't as good as it was with the dates. So what could you substitute for the dates? Well, certainly not prunes like the gentleman I was referring to earlier, but maybe a beet. You want to think about the purpose of the dates was the sweetness to balance the acidity. And so instead of just spoon feeding you guys answers, I'd like you to start getting creative in your own kitchen and think about, okay, I'm making Chef AJ's red lentil chili tonight, and I'm out of dates, and I don't have time to go to the store. What could I use in my house? Well, what sweetness could balance the acidity? Could raisins work? Well, maybe, but raisins have a little bit different flavor profile than dates. Dates are pretty neutral, but raisins have a much stronger depth of flavor. So the way my brain works is, well, what about an apple? Or maybe a half of an apple. Kathy Fisher uses an apple in her ketchup recipe that's SOS free. What about a beet? What about a cooked beet? And so that's how I think about when I have to substitute sugar. Now, a lot of people write me with dessert recipes and they say, how much date paste can I use? And the thing is I don't know without making your first recipe, because I don't know how sweet this recipe is. I wish I could tell you that there was a rule of thumb where if a recipe called for a cup of white sugar, it's this much dates. But I really don't know, because what you have to understand with sugar is, again, we're talking density now. Liquid sweeteners and non-liquid sweeteners are completely different. Remember, baking is a science more than an art. So if you saw a recipe where the sweetener was maple syrup, you're pretty safe substituting agave, another liquid sweetener for a liquid sweetener. Now, agave is a little bit sweeter, so it might be a little sweeter, but you're pretty safe substituting it. And you're pretty safe substituting date syrup for maple syrup or agave, realizing that date syrup is less sweet. Remember, there's a hierarchy to sweeteners, with probably agave of the liquid sweeteners being the sweetest, and probably molasses being the less sweet. And there's also barley malt. There's also rice syrup. So these are a little bit sweeter. So probably the sweetest would be agave, then would be maple syrup, then would be date syrup, then would probably be brown rice syrup, barley malt, and molasses. So while in terms of the recipe coming out in terms of the density, like for it to bake, yes, you could probably substitute equal amounts. What you have to realize is they all vary in sweetness. So you're not going to necessarily get the same taste as what the recipe writer created. Even substituting white sugar for brown sugar, there's a different density to brown sugar. Brown sugar is white sugar to which molasses has been added. Now, in my opinion, I call sugar, oil, and salt the evil trinity, because I think they're all bad. Sugar is sugar, oil and oil is salt. And people will argue for their sweetener being the best. Well, what about coconut sugar? It has some trace minerals, or coconut oil. It's, a medium chain fatty acid or low glycemic or whatever. But the thing is, we're talking about in terms of creating recipes. You can't just substitute a liquid sweetener for a solid sweetener. There actually are conversion websites I've looked up that will tell you an idea what they think you would do in terms of that. But if you're substituting a granulated sweetener for a liquid one, well, guess what? Now you need to add some type of liquid to it, whether it's oil or plant milk or water. It won't work as a straight conversion. And with date paste, it is much harder. And here's why, guys. There is no universally accepted date paste. And what I mean by that is, when I make date paste, which is on page 60 of my book, Unprocessed, my formula for date paste is 1 pound of dates soaked in 1 cup of liquid. And this is the date paste that I use in all my recipes. Well, other fine chefs like Del Schroff, his date paste formula is different. again, it's how much liquid is in it is going to make a difference, especially in baked recipes. So in my recipes, I know how much date paste goes in there because I created the recipe myself through trial and error. And so that's why it's a little bit more difficult to just take one sweetener for another sweetener, especially in somebody else's recipe. I mean, you could try you may hit a home run on the first try and get lucky and do that, but there is no exact ratio. I would say, in my experience for the recipes that I've done myself, that if it had 1 cup of, and remember, it's been probably 10 years now that the only sweeteners I've used are fruit, dates and date syrup and date paste. In my experience, for my recipes, when I've used a recipe that would call for 1 cup of date syrup, I have needed 1.5 cups of date paste, but my recipe for date paste. And by the way, in many of the markets, at least in Los Angeles, you can buy date paste already made. And all it is dates that have gone through an extruder, like when they make chopped liver, like a shower head. But with that, that wouldn't work in my recipes. There's no liquid. So I hope this makes sense, that with baking, I think it gets a little bit more difficult. And since we're talking about baking, let's talk about flour for a minute, because once again, you can't necessarily just substitute one flour for the other. In the restaurant that I worked at, the flour that they used was spelt flour, and I only had one recipe with flour, the German chocolate cake. But I found that other flours that had similar densities, like barley flour, would work just as well. And white flour would work too. But if you want a light and fluffy pastry, you can't just substitute whole wheat flour for that. I mean, you can, but it won't come out like the original recipe that was created. Now, gluten-free wasn't as prevalent 10 years ago as it is now. And so now they're trying everything to be gluten-free. And in the bakery that I worked at, or the restaurant, that was the only dessert that wasn't gluten-free. And that's because they didn't use gluten-free flour. But there are websites and even cookbooks now that will tell you the substitution of one flour for the other flour. And they're interchangeable to a certain degree. But remember, flours vary also in the degree of gluten that they have, this protein, and also the degree to which they will rise. And so sometimes if you're substituting flour, you're going to have to put in something else to account for that. So I don't use flour at all. There's a couple of exceptions, and we'll get to these in the questions about grinding the millet for my millet muffins. But in general, you can't just take oats, for example, rolled oats, grind them into a flour, and have the cake come out the same way it would as if you were using white pastry flour. I mean, it still may be very good and tasty, but if we're talking about texture and having it be like a bakery cake, flours just aren't interchangeable either, unfortunately. Now, with gluten, they now have blends of flours, like Bob's Red Mill, even Trader Joe's. They make a blend of gluten-free flour that has made it much easier for people baking, because they have instructions on the package that tell you exactly what to do. Sometimes they'll tell you to add xanthan gum, but just know that, at least in my opinion, you can't just do these swap outs and expect it to have the same result. So let's get to salt now, because salt is the hardest for most people. And when I say that, you can certainly make things without oil taste really good, especially if you've neuroadapted, and especially if you're willing to use the whole food plant fats. And most people are pretty satisfied with rich desserts that are made with dates or date paste. They don't miss the sugar. But there's nothing like salt, in my opinion, that tastes salty. I mean, there are things that taste salty, but whatever salt does in a recipe, it seems to be the hardest thing for people to do without. And it seems to be the hardest thing even for the chefs like Chef Bravo that work with this kind of eating to emulate. I mean, I'm going to tell you what I do now. The best thing would be to neuroadapt and not eat salt for 30 days so that all the food that we're proposing you eat tastes delicious. But it's hard because we have taste buds on the tip of our tongue for sweet and salty, and we are really used to eating a lot of salt in this country, either through processed food, which we get about 67 to 72% of our calories from, or from things like bread, where you don't taste the salt, but they're in there. There's actually more salt in bread than there is even in things like potato chips or French fries, where it's on the surface of the food. So for me, it's a matter of finding a salt-free seasoning you like. And again, I mentioned my favorite is Benson's Table Tasty. She has a whole line of salt-free seasonings. I'll show you some of them. Bravado, Gusto. It sounds like Gustavo. We've got Heritage. There's just so many different flavors. and hopefully you'll find one you like. And that's enough for a lot of people to use as a substitute. But again, it's not always an equal substitute, because if it called for a teaspoon of salt, it may need more than a teaspoon of salt-free seasoning. The other thing I want you to realize is that all the salt-free seasonings are different. So here I've got one that's a salt-free garlic and herb blend that I got at Costco. I've got one that Mary McDougall has talked about, this organic no salt seasoning from Costco. They also sell it at Trader Joe's. Well, neither of them taste like Benson's Table Tasty. And all of my recipes that I created were using Benson's. So if you decide to substitute another salt-free seasoning, it doesn't mean it won't taste good. It might be even more delicious, but it's not necessarily going to taste like the recipe I created. And if you do want to try a sample of Benson's Table Tasty, I'm pretty sure that she still, for $1 for postage, will send you one just to see if you like it. And I also have a discount code Chef AJ for 10% off. Or if you come to the Live Ultimate Weight Loss Conference in September, she'll be there so that you can taste them. Fresh herbs don't replicate or emulate salt, but they make food taste delicious so that maybe you won't miss it a lot. Fresh herbs to dried herbs is a 3-to-1 ratio. So if a recipe calls for, say, a teaspoon of dried basil, you would need a tablespoon of fresh basil. But using fresh herbs really helps bump up the flavor of a dish so that you may not miss salt as much, as does using one of my favorite things, which are sun-dried tomatoes. I believe I have a sun-dried tomato powder right here. There are stores like Savory in Santa Rosa and stores like Penzeys, which we have here, that sell amazing seasonings. And one of the things I would encourage you to do wherever you live is to go to a spice store, and they generally let you taste the spices, because spices vary greatly. To give you an example, my favorite spice is smoked paprika. And this is a smoked paprika from Costco. And it's very good and it's very affordable. But when I'm cooking for special people, I use a higher end one from another country. I forget where this is from, but it tastes completely different. Let's see. Well, it's in another language, but here's a different smoked paprika. And the Cadillac of smoked paprika that Sabrina Nelson introduced me to, this one I use very sparingly for when I really want to impress people. So the point is that all spices are not created equal, especially when they're blends. And this is something I made a big point in my next book to talk about. We have here, for example, pumpkin pie spice. We've got two different companies. We've got the Trader Joe's and another company called Frontier. Now, they're both good, but they're both different. And if you read the ingredients, they're completely different ingredients. Other than that they both have cinnamon, they have nothing in common. It's really important when you use spices, well, first of all, that they be fresh. And now you can actually buy spices at places like Whole Foods and just get enough for a recipe. You don't want to have spices. I remember when my mother moved, she had this jar of Coleman's dry mustard that, like, from when I was 6 years old. I don't know what the shelf life of spices are, but you can guess that if you haven't used them in 6 months or at least a year, it's probably time to throw them out. It's not that they'll hurt you, but they won't taste as good. Just like medication, they'll lose their potency. But the thing is I encourage you to taste your spices before you use them, because they taste completely different. For example, I use a salt-free chili powder from Whole Foods in my bean burgers that people love, the Chipotle bean burgers. Well, Shayna uses Penzeys Chili 9000. And somebody used something called Bravado from Benson's, which is so spicy that they couldn't eat the burgers. So the thing is it doesn't matter what you use what you like, but taste it. You need to taste your spices because they taste completely different. Now, of course, salt tastes like salt and black pepper tastes like black pepper. I mean, there's different kinds of pepper and different kinds of salt, but it's really important that you like the spices you're using. When I was doing a demonstration of my apple pie rice pudding in Marshall, Texas, the event coordinator got me some apple pie spice, which is, this is a pretty common spice. At least you can get it at just your Kroger's here. This is the brand I would use. Well, she got me a brand I had never heard of from a company I had never heard of. And I didn't know this at the time. I didn't even read what the ingredients were. We put it in a recipe that most people find is delicious, nobody would eat. Well, it turned out that the second ingredient in this blend was fenugreek, which I didn't even know what it was, but I tell you, have no business being in a dessert. So that's why when you're doing a spice blend, make sure you read it carefully and make sure you taste it. That's why I encourage people to go to these spice stores, taste the spices. Once you know what you like, you can order it online, but just realize that you may not like the spices that you're buying. Now, sea vegetables are great for imparting a salty flavor in things. So kelp and dulse come in granules. These are two of my favorites, but my all-time favorite is something called smoked dulse. And I get it at seaveg.com. Maine Coast Sea Vegetables, I believe, is the company. And it actually, if you've ever eaten bacon, I'm told it tastes like bacon. And so these things can be chopped up finely, put in soup, stews, and salad. And these impart a very, very salty flavor. As a matter of fact, when I was a pastry chef, I would be so disgusted with the sickly sweet taste in my mouth from having to taste what I made, is that I would have dulse and I would put it in my mouth just to get the taste of sweet out. So these are also a great substitute for salt. One of the things you can do, and it depends how far you want to go, is I have a machine called a dehydrator, and I actually dehydrate celery. And then what I do is I put it in my Vitamix, and then it's not celery salt, because celery salt has celery. This is just ground up celery. And guess what? Celery is basically salt and water, and this tastes like a lot of salt. So the other way you can get a salty flavor in your dishes is by using things like greens. They taste incredibly salty. Using things like celery, things that are really salty, and that will bump up the saltiness of the dish. Another trick is to use sour. Our taste buds for salt sit right next to our taste buds for sour. So a lot of times, if we give ourselves something sour, like the juice of the lemon or the lime or some vinegar, for some reason it tricks our brain or our palate. I'm not sure how that works. Dr. Clapper always talks about this, thinking that we had something salty when we didn't. If you can't get sun-dried tomato powder where you live, I put that as an ingredient in recipes in my book Unprocessed, and we're going to do a revised edition to tell people you can actually make your own very quickly and easily and cheaply. You get the sun-dried tomatoes, not the kind that are packed in oil, and you use either a coffee grinder or a Vitamix, and you can actually grind it into a powder. Now, some of them are going to be treated with sulfite, so they'll be really soft, so it won't really be like a powdery powder, it'll be like a crumble, but some of them are very hard, like the ones that are sold by the company Melissa's or Just Tomatoes, which you can also get both online, and you actually will get a crumbly powder. And I find that if you use sun-dried tomato powder as a seasoning, even on the table, it really does make dishes delicious, and you can actually flavor it. I've done it, Chipotle sun-dried tomato powder. There's different flavors you can use. Smoked paprika sun-dried tomato powder. If I had more time, I probably would like to actually develop a spice line. And by the way, there's other wonderful companies than Benson's that create salt-free seasonings. Chef Terry of Be Mon Paz has a line of salt-free seasonings. I don't use them because they contain black pepper, although she said she would make some without black pepper for myself and my supporters. And a new company I just found up north called, I believe it's the Spicery Shop, that on the next webinar that Gustavo and I do where we're cooking, I'm using a pepperoni pizza blend that just knocked my socks off. It tasted like eating pepperoni pizza. So again, there's so many salt-free seasonings that exist already. There's Mrs. Dash, which comes in many flavors. I mean, these are ones that have existed forever. There's this one called Bell's, this one called AJ's, no relation. But there's just so many that just having this on your table, onion and garlic spice. So the thing is that we're not trying to get you to live a life without flavor. We're just trying to get you to live a life without salt or with less salt. And I happen to be allergic to black pepper, but if you're not, that's a great spice to use for things. All right, so sugar, oil, flour, alcohol, salt. We talked about the high-fat plant foods. By the way, I believe that they're pretty much can be substituted for each other, at least in my recipes. So if a recipe calls for peanut butter, which not everybody wants to use, you could certainly substitute almond butter, tahini. So I believe that the nuts and the seeds are interchangeable with each other in my recipes, like the faux parmesan. Those are completely interchangeable. But what if you don't want to use nuts? Well, this is why I'm revising my book Unprocessed, because now we know that some people do better, especially where weight loss is concerned, on a lower fat diet. So what can we use instead of nuts? Well, two things. And it depends, again, on the recipe. So there's I can't just say beans and I can't just say oats because it depends. So what we've done in my book Unprocessed, for example, on page 100, the recipe for disappearing lasagna. Well, it calls for a cup of pine nuts. Everybody that eats it gets about 4 teaspoons per serving. So it's certainly a reasonable amount of nuts, but there are people, either because they're food addicts and nuts are a trigger, or they're Dr. Esselson's patient, they can't have any nuts. Well, in that particular recipe, I've found, and that's why every recipe is different, that we can take out the pine nuts and the recipe's still good. We don't miss it that much because it wasn't really an integral part of the recipe. But say a recipe like I'm trying to think where nuts are. Okay. Well, actually, this turns out it's not an integral part of a lot of my recipe because now that I've learned these substitutions, so I'll give you an example. So the faux parmesan, that's a really popular recipe in my book where you take a cup of, say, walnuts or sunflower seeds or pumpkin seeds, and you mix it with some nutritional yeast and some salt-free seasoning, and you have this topping that's really delicious on foods. It tastes a little bit fatty, a little bit salty like cheese. It's faux parmesan, but a cup of nuts is just too much for a lot of people. So I found that oats, rolled oats, are a great substitute for nuts in a savory recipe like that. Turned out they weren't as potent, so I needed to bump up how much nutritional yeast I used, but that was a great substitute in that recipe. Now, in the recipes where nuts were being used as a flour, I found that oats were also a good substitute. So I have a recipe called brownies, which are just dates, walnuts, cocoa powder, and I found that I could use oats in place of either all or some of the nuts. Now, one of the things that worked really well in my recipes for substitution is using beans instead of nuts. So beans are great because, well, people love them and they're lower in caloric density and there's so many health benefits. But in recipes like, for example, my pesto stuffed mushrooms, which called, again, for a cup of pine nuts, that's a lot, especially because it only made maybe 12 mushrooms, is that we could take beans, either cannellini beans, not all beans, by the way. I don't recommend, again, I'm not saying any bean, black bean, kidney bean. I don't think it would taste so good in that recipe. But we could take garbanzo beans or cannellini beans and make the pesto with beans instead of nuts and still have a delicious outcome. Now, some of those recipes in that book, because I didn't realize that miso was not allowed by Dr. Goldhammer, have miso. So I don't have a substitute for miso other than what I taught you about using some of these herbs and spices and salt-free seasoning to make it, feel like you had salt, but at least you're taking out the fat. So at least in my recipes, I have found that you can use beans in place of nuts if they're in savory recipes, and you can use oats in the dessert recipes, and in case of the faux parmesan, even in some of those recipes. But then I was faced with another challenge. I had a client that was born with an anaphylactic allergy to legumes, all of them, which includes the sugar snap peas and the green beans and peanuts. And she carries an EpiPen around. And there were a lot of recipes that she couldn't have. So I'm thinking, okay, now what? Now what do we do? I finally figured out you can substitute beans for nuts, but what am I going to do? So what I found in recipes that contain beans, what you can substitute is cauliflower puree. That works beautifully. You can just take a whole head of cauliflower, steam it in the Instant Pot, and blend it. It might not even need any water at all. Or if you buy frozen cauliflower, when it defrosts, there's enough water. And I mean, there's ways to make cauliflower puree fancier. There's really fancy recipes where you strain it through a bag and you use lemon juice and all this. But I found just pureed cauliflower works beautifully in a lot of these recipes that call for beans for people that either can't eat them for an anaphylactic reason, or some people with things like SIBO and IBS are limiting or not eating beans, and it also works great. And also, cauliflower comes in different colors, by the way. There's purple, there's orange, and so that could depend on what you're making. You might want a beautiful color for one reason if you're making a special sauce or things like that. And I know it works because the client that I gave this idea to really wanted to make a recipe of Ann Esselstyn called Eat Loaf, which is like one of her best recipes. It's like a meatloaf, but it called for beans. And she substituted the cauliflower puree, and it worked great. I can't promise you it will work in all the recipes, but in the ones I've tried, it has been a great, great substitute for the beans. Let's see. Now, one thing I wanted to add. Okay, so one way to make things more flavorful is to roast them. So if you roast fruit, for example, and a lot of people think it's weird, why would I roast fruit? Well, because you're trying to get a sweeter outcome in your recipe. So for example, one of the things I learned is that not everybody can have dates. I've only met 2 people now that were actually allergic to them, but there were people that said, you know what, I'm a food addict, I can't have any. So I wanted to try to recreate some of my recipes because I barely have time to do mine than to deal with yours, with all due respect. But what I wanted to do is try to see if I could take some of my recipes and not use dates or cut down the use of dates. So I did this by using various fruits. So one of the things that I recommend are pears. Pears are very, very sweet, but realize that, oh, okay, sorry, just got a little sign that says to wrap it up, but I'm doing the best I can. I'm trying to get through my list and then still answer the questions. All right, so pears are great because when you use them, first of all, they're very sweet if they're ripe, but when you roast them, you caramelize them and you bring out the natural sugars. So I have found that I could substitute roasted pears for dates in many of my recipes. I think now we have people, one of the questions was about bananas being a migraine and what do I do? I don't have a real good substitute for bananas, especially if they're being used in a smoothie, because bananas being a high sugar, low water fruit are really great for smoothies because they provide creaminess. But I really love using very, very ripe bananas in my recipes now, because then I don't have to use dates anymore. If I get really, really ripe bananas, I can do that. Plus, I've got the fact that they also are a substitute for oil because it's the same thing as applesauce. And certainly you could substitute applesauce for bananas if you're using them in place of oil. But remember, it's not going to be as sweet. So then we got to figure out, well, what are we going to do for the sweetener? So Gustavo was telling me I should wrap it up. The two things that I didn't deal with, the special diets, were nightshades and FODMAPs, people following those diets. Maybe we could address that in another time. I don't know if you want to end right now, Gustavo, or have me answer.
Yeah, it's just that we have quite maybe 2 or 3 really good questions, and I wanted to make sure.
Sure, absolutely.
And then we can continue, But before we get off this topic, processed, some people are a little confused about what processing. Some people say, well, is it okay then to grind celery? I mean, isn't it? I mean, can you talk a little bit about processed food, which is void of fiber and water and nutrients, and what we're talking about as
sure. I don't think that processing a food in a food processor or a blender is the same as refining a food where you're removing anything. So in the case of this celery seasoning, yes, I remove the water by dehydrating, but I don't consider that a processed food. To me, processed food is food that's manufactured in a plant that comes in a can, a box, a bottle, or a bag. My feeling is if you can make it at home in your own kitchen, then yeah, you're processing it, but it's not refined, and you're not taking in. Yes, we took out water, but you're not disrupting the fiber or taking out the vitamins and minerals. Before I forget, there's one thing I want to mention about you can't just remove things from recipes, in my opinion, and make them taste good. So one of the best recipes I've created, at least according to people that have tried it, is the barefoot salad dressing, which we did in the last webinar. It's a dressing that I've gotten lots of emails from children saying this is the first time I've been able to eat salad. It's a fabulous recipe. And what's interesting about the recipe is it was created because there was this girl, a friend of mine, that said, I hate lime juice. No, not lime juice. She goes, I hate vinegar and I hate mustard. Because I made this dressing called House Dressing 2.0, which was vinegar, lime juice, and mustard. And she wouldn't eat it. And I said, I thought to myself, you can't be. So I used that as a base to create barefoot dressing, which has those 3 ingredients. But I had a lot more things put in. And one of the things that was put in was nutritional yeast. Well, I have a friend that is allergic to nutritional yeast. And so I tried to make the dressing taking it out, and it didn't fly. Because when I create recipes, I'm creating the ingredients in symphony with each other, which is why I think it's very hard to just take stuff out and expect it to work if it's a recipe that's been created. This is where we need somebody like Kathy Hester that really is a food scientist to figure out how to make it work. So anyway.
Okay, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about nightshades, because people
right. So here's the thing, guys. If you Google, so the nightshades are generally it's tomato, bell pepper, potato, eggplant. I believe those are the 4 main ones. Tobacco is a nightshade. People don't eat that. And one of the things I've learned in True North is that people can be sensitive to one of them or some of them and not all of them. And so a lot of times they'll tell you to do a test and go 30 days without any of them and then introduce them one at a time to see if you really do have a nightshade sensitivity, which in some people show up as joint pain. Well, the potato can easily be substituted because, not easily, but you can substitute sweet potatoes. And so if you are going to make mashed potatoes, you could make mashed parsnips. You could make mashed cauliflower. You could make mashed sweet potatoes. So I think potato is probably the easiest nightshade to substitute. You can make sweet potato fries. I don't really have a good substitute for bell pepper, tomato, or eggplant. Maybe mushroom, maybe portobello mushroom for the eggplant. If we're talking about texture, eggplant doesn't have a lot of taste. But the places that I've looked it up generally say beet plus carrot can often take the place of tomato, like if you're doing a marinara sauce. But there are entire dedicated websites to this nightshade problem that will help people find a substitute for these things. And it is difficult from a culinary standpoint, especially to tomato, because tomato is an ingredient in so many recipes, including my own. And so it requires further discussion. And I'm sure any day now there's going to be a nightshade-free, low FODMAP, gluten-free cookbook coming out for vegans.
Why don't we briefly mention, because so many people are anxious to hear about the cram muffin. Let's mention that, and then we can continue so that those people that need to leave.
To go. Okay. Well, the cram muffins are, I wish I should have made them to show you. It was an homage to Dr. Doug Lisle, who discovered something called the cram circuit, explaining why people either overeat or binge at night, even if they're full. And he presented this information at the Ultimate Weight Loss Conference in Las Vegas. And we all know, not maybe we all don't know, but if you've heard him speak, we know that Dr. Lisle loves carrot cake. And so I wanted to create something that was very healthy that people could cram at night instead of binging on unhealthy food. So I call these cram muffins. They stand for carrot, raisin, apple, and millet, and they taste like these little gems of carrot cake without the frosting. And so that's one of the recipes we're going to show you that we actually made on the next webinar. And I can't wait to get to True North and see if Dr. Lisle himself will like them. So do you want me to get to these questions, or?
Go ahead. I'm just going to put, we're going to put up the button if people want to register for that.
Terrific. Yeah, I think we're doing that in 10 days or so. So Bruce's question is, what is the best way to cook mushrooms to get the closest taste, color, and texture versus sauteing them in oil? If you go to the episode of The Chef and the Dietitian where I make the disappearing lasagna, I show you that. But it's really just about learning to saute without oil. You don't need oil. You can absolutely get the same texture, color, and taste, I promise you. And especially if you are using salt, one of the things I didn't mention, not everybody wants to go zero salt. There are things like raw coconut aminos, which have 90 milligrams of sodium per teaspoon instead of 2,300 milligrams. Using things like that in your sauteing, in judicious amounts, or even the low sodium misos, you can get the taste of what you're going for. But the thing is remember, the oil has no taste, you guys. So that's not what you're getting from sauteing them. I promise you, what you're getting is more dopamine being produced in the brain. You like it because it's a high-fat, high-calorie food, but it's not the taste that I think some of you are missing. So Subhajit says, one of the recipes I enjoy is roasted mixed vegetables with seasonings and a little bit of olive oil or avocado. Do you have a version of roasted vegetables with none of that? Yes, absolutely. The oven roasted ratatouille. You can see me make that in, I believe, episode 108 of Healthy Living with Chef AJ, but it tastes phenomenal and you will not miss the oil or the salt. They don't stick to the roasting pan if you put a silpat, a silicone baking mat, or a piece of parchment paper on them. So that's that question there. Okay. Angel wants to know, using the Instant Pot, can I give the best brown rice to water ratio and time? So I don't memorize anything. They say that Einstein didn't even know his own phone number. So I just take one of the wonderful pressure cooking cookbooks. I open it up, and that's how I found out what it is. I don't have room in my brain to memorize this. What does it say for brown rice? Rice. Okay. And there's a chart right there. 1 cup to 2 cups of boiling liquid. And that's what I do. So I use that for all my grains. I just really can't. I have quinoa and millet memorized because I do those all the time. And often I do my brown rice in a rice maker because my pressure cooker actually is busy because I'm always using it for other things. So I recommend a good pressure cooking cookbook. There's about 5 vegan ones out there now, and they all have charts in it. Or you can just go to Pressure Cooking for Dummies, and they'll give you a chart as well. But I don't have any special secret, if that's what you mean. Okay. So Cheryl was saying, do you have caramelization without oil? There's a recipe in my book on processed for caramelized onions, and you do it in the oven. You don't even have to be there to saute it, and it's incredible. I recommend that one. She says squash and potatoes always shrivel up when roasting with just broth and wine. I don't find that to be the case. The oil doesn't make them not shrivel. An air fryer would be great too, as a matter of fact, to make these vegetables delicious. So you know, if you had you here in my kitchen, I could show you. That's what we do in the classes. We roast several different kinds of vegetables, and I don't really see any shriveling difference between. Again, I don't use oil, but even when I did, so yeah.
How do you use miso in cooking, AJ?
Yeah, so miso paste is a fermented paste often made out of soybeans, sometimes azuki beans or brown rice. It's a fermented food that Asians use in many of the recipes. And when I did use it, I used it as a salt substitute because it was incredibly salty, although they do have low sodium varieties now. So generally I used it in a recipe like a pesto instead of salt, or in a salad dressing to replace the salt. But it really, at the end of the day, even though it may be lower in sodium, it still is salt. But it is very, very flavorful. Okay. So Veronica says, do I have any suggestions for fat-free sauces, dressings that don't contain vinegar and aren't sweet and aren't just mashed beans with spices? Can't have anything fermented and cultured. Don't eat nightshades. So again, what I would do is anything that can be pureed can be a sauce. So for example, I meant to show this because there is a question about the millet muffins. These are heavy. So these are roasted sweet potatoes. And by the way, every cooking method yields different tastes. So when you roast sweet potatoes in your oven, it tastes a lot different than when you microwave them, or if you put them in an Instant Pot or using a wet cooking method. If you want them the most sweet and flavorful, you'll want to roast them. You can puree sweet potatoes, and that can be a base for the most absolute delicious sauce and salad dressing. I've done that. I don't know what seasonings you particularly like, but there's nothing fermented or cultured in that. It's not mashed beans, and there's no vinegars. If you think it's too sweet, then use regular potatoes. You can do pureed Yukon Gold potatoes. You could do cauliflower. Almost everything can be pureed. I have Japanese sweet potatoes right here. Again, you're saying you don't want anything sweet. I need more information as to what you like. Salsa, that doesn't have vinegar, and that can be a sauce. Salsas can be pureed. You know, I'm sorry you don't like vinegar because, you know, my number one recommendation, especially for salad dressings and people trying to get off oil, are the vinegars, either the Be Mom Pa or the ones you can get at Whole Foods, the Napa Valley Naturals, you know, different price points, but absolutely delicious. I probably have 60 flavors, and so I never get bored. And by the way, when you do roast your vegetables or mushrooms or saute them or caramelize, just a little bit of hit of balsamic at the end is absolutely incredible. So another thing you can do for fat-free sauces, Veronica, is Kathy Hester contributed a ranch dressing to my next book, and what she did is she used something called onion cream. If you were to go to Fat-Free Vegan, you could learn how to make it. But basically, you take an onion and you either roast it or you cook it in the Instant Pot and you puree it. And it literally is pure heaven, even by itself. But you can add spices to it that you enjoy. So that's what I would probably do. And that would not be a sweet salad dressing. And that would not have any vinegar or nightshades in it. So Catherine wants to know, are flours that I make myself okay to use, grinding millet and oatmeal? So when she said okay, I didn't know if she meant okay like for equal substitutions or okay if she was following the Ultimate Weight Loss Program. So I'll answer it both ways. It absolutely is okay. But as I said earlier, it doesn't always translate exactly the same if you take a recipe that had white flour and then now grind the oats. It will work. It will just be more dense. Now, in the millet muffins that we did in our very first webinar together, I had people grind a half a cup of millet. And the reason is because oats tend to get very gummy. And if I'm trying to create a texture, because even though I'm somebody following the Ultimate Weight Loss Program, I'm still a chef, and I was a pastry chef, and I want my recipes to be familiar and eaten by people that don't eat this way. When you just bake with oats, they've got a very gummy texture. And so I found that by using a little bit of ground millet, which, yes, when you grind millet, it's technically a flour, even though you're grinding it yourself. You can buy millet flour, but it's cheaper to grind your own. It offsets the gumminess. Now, a lot of people have made this recipe and loved it, and they have actually used the millet whole. Millet is birdseed, by the way, and they like the crunch. Or the recipe says you can just use a half a cup of oats. You don't have to use the millet. So some of the things I do are more from a culinary standpoint than a food addiction standpoint. But again, it just depends if it's a trigger for you, having these ground flours. The recipe as it stands would have about 4 teaspoons of this ground millet in the muffin. And for some people, it's absolutely fine, depending on where they are in their recovery. And for some people, it's not. That's why I like to give options. She also has a problem with bananas. It's a migraine trigger. As I mentioned, that's a hard thing because nothing they're so perfect for so many things that I do. If it was like a smoothie and you were trying to create creaminess, an avocado might work, canned pumpkin might work, tofu might work, apple butter. But for flavor wise, because of the sweetness, I don't have an option. If you're talking about in that recipe, then what I would do is just use the absolute sweetest sweet potato, which is why in the Millet muffins, I called for the Japanese sweet potatoes, because they are much sweeter, in my opinion, than any other varieties, and they're also denser. And that's another example of substituting. So some people where they live, they can't find Japanese sweet potatoes. So they had to use the orange ones. And they said the muffins were still good, but they're going to be a lot moister than denser. And that's where I would come in and say, well, maybe you need to use a little bit of oats because you're looking for a certain texture. So that's the question there. We've got, I think, two more. Okay. So Sid says, do I have a good key lime pie recipe? So I haven't made key lime pie since culinary school 15 years ago. The way we made it was we used avocado and lime and dates, and I believe we were using coconut oil in that school. So I got rid of all my recipes and all my cookbooks that weren't SOS free. So I personally don't have it. If I were to be instructed to make one today, that's what I would do. Is I would do a date nut crust with something like macadamia nuts and coconut, probably to offset the lime. I would use either tofu or avocado, which, by the way, are interchangeable in my recipes. In my dessert recipes, every now and then we get somebody that's allergic to soy when we're doing these tofu things. So the avocado is a great substitute if it's going to have chocolate in it. If it's not going to have chocolate, it won't be a great substitute because it will turn it green. So if you want a great key lime recipe, the Cafe Gratitude dessert cookbook has a really wonderful one in it. And so the last question is from Dixie, and that was how to make an Asian sauce for use in stir fry with rice. Well, that is the age-old question, my dear, because what are Asian sauces other than sugar, fat, salt, and flour? Think about it. They are generally made with some kind of sesame oil. They're made with some kind of sugar, and they're made with some kind of soy sauce or miso. And then they've got cornstarch, which is like flour mixed in. So if you're somebody avoiding the evil trinity of sugar, oil, salt, or the sofas, the sugar, oil, flour, I don't know how to do it. Now, I know how to create Asian flavors, which are generally ginger and garlic and lemongrass and things like that, which is why the ultimate sauce that you get in the 21-day guide is very much tasting like a peanut sauce. But to do that, I had to use dates, and I had to use vinegar and lime juice and things like that. So I don't know how to create an Asian sauce, because when I think of Asian sauces, I think of garlic sauce, I think of brown sauce, I think of sweet and sour sauce. And I don't know how to do that without sugar, oil, and salt. And that's why people like them so much. You could off the top of my head, because I just got this question, what I'm thinking, if we're not using dates, what are we going to use to sweeten a sauce? Because that's what an Asian sauce generally is. And we're not going to be using roasted pears or bananas in this. So off the top of my head, I'm thinking of something like rice vinegar, which is often sweetened, but an unsweetened one with some dates. But how would we get the saltiness? Maybe some sea vegetables. It's a tough one, Dixie, and I don't have the answer to that. I haven't seen an SOS-free recipe for Asian sauce, but you can bet that as soon as we get off this webinar, I'm going to be calling Kathy Hester and asking her how to do it. Thanks for the great questions.
Very good. Thank you so much, AJ. This has been wonderful. Just wonderful to get all the ideas. And I know people want to watch the replay to take notes because you've covered so much information. But thank you. And I think I will see you next Monday when we do your cram muffins that are, people are just dying to taste them. So we're going to do that next Monday. And thank you again for making the time to be here.
Well, thank you guys for wanting to eat healthy. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.